Rockefeller, and alliances,
You've
being
nailed it.
reset up.
You really nailed it because, and we get into that. I have a chapter where I go into more detail on the SIS, and the SIS deserves its own book. It really does. It's an area of intelligence history and State Department history that we haven't even scratched the surface. But when Hoover was given the green light, in other words, I believe, Hoover did not want to do this. In other words, Hoover was essentially the good soldier. Clicks his heels, salutes smartly, okay? And the president said, we've got to set up an intelligence service. And we have to set it up now. This is in May of 1940. So it's set up like in 2 months. And Hoover is sending guys down to Latin America. It probably looks like you, probably younger than you or younger than me, okay, to go down there, and under business cover. But there is no business. So the moment they start saying, well, I'm Joe Fabitz from the Aluminum Siding and Storm Door Company, and they say, well, show me your literature. Where in New York? There was no backstopping, zero backstopping, and the Bureau admits it. They said, we screwed this up completely. So then they send you back, and now you're with what? You're with, pardon me? Coffee. Well, coffee, Procter & Gamble. You're with Merrill Lynch, Walt Disney. They had one agent posing as a representative of Walt Disney who went down to Brazil and was able to get out into the jungles of Brazil, okay, to cover leads. What was his cover? His cover was, I work for Walt Disney. Walt Disney was magic in this period. Why? Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse and all of the great colored movies. What am I trying to say? In other words, color movies of parrots and jungle birds, for example. The sales of Disney movies in Brazil skyrocketed, okay? And this individual would go down there. I work for Walt Disney. He had access to same thing. One Armor Meat Company. They were able to get out onto the Pampas. The problem was, how do you get your information back to Washington? Okay, you can't put it in a secret writing. It's too voluminous. So what does Hoover try to do? Hoover tries to go to the State Department, and the State Department, forgive me for saying this, State Department says, no, we don't do that. Okay, so through Sproul Braden, it starts with Sproul Braden, and Sproul Braden, who was the ambassador to Colombia, said, I want somebody from the FBI down here because the intelligence is poor, and that's how it started. And in one embassy, the individual would be the civil attaché. And the other embassy, he'd be an attaché, or another embassy, he'd be the legal attaché. Had all sorts of but initially the State Department was loath to have somebody as an FBI agent posing as a diplomat. I mean, that just was culturally unacceptable. And later what we begin to see FBI agents posing as what? Diplomatic couriers, because they have to begin to send codes. And then you begin to see another fascinating aspect of this whole thing is separate communications. Initially, the FBI agents in the embassy had to use State Department communications. And the idea was for the communication to go out, and once it got to the old executive office building, was where State was located at the time, the person receiving it would see Hoover. Well, he wasn't supposed to even look at the document after that. He was just supposed to let it print out, and he'd look every once in a while, and where it ended, that went over to the FBI. Well, Hoover basically said, I don't think that's going to work. So basically, Hoover sets up his own communication system, and that's a fascinating story, too. I didn't mean to get off on a tangent, but there were a lot of turf battles. There was a lot of blood on the bureaucratic floors of Washington at that time. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
While we're on the subject of turf battles, he mentioned the ones among the civilian agencies in the U.S., but of course MI5, MI6 are both military intelligence agencies. So where was our Department of War and then Department of Defense in all this, and how did the military play into the intel and counterintelligence efforts in the Second World War?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I get into that. I'm not an expert, and I don't claim to be a military expert, but we know today that there was no joint commands. You had strong personalities like Ernest King, who it was his way or the highway. And then you had personalities like George C. Marshall, okay? And then you had strong personalities like Hap Arnold. And they didn't talk to one another. They had to cooperate, but everything was very, very stovepipe. And there was enormous bitter rivalry within the military and tensions within the military. And that played over to the FBI, and it also played over to Donovan as well, trying to get cooperation. Where what I write about, and I hope you read about this, you see, if you're familiar with the double cross system, in Great Britain, where they had this remarkable stable of double agents feeding bogus and true information to the Germans about the timing of the invasion of Normandy. They had a more collegial approach to it. You're from the Army, you're from the Navy, you're from here, we're all sitting down together, and we're going over what can be passed and what can't be passed. You don't see that in the United States because of these turf battles. You see the military telling the Bureau, have your double agent weave this into the narrative, weave this into his information. But they never inform the FBI about the feedback. There is no feedback at all. You see the rivalry between Donovan. I mean, it's like the Night of the Long Knives. I mean, they get along like a lit match in gas fumes, okay? But you see that rivalry. You see also, what's fascinating, the intense rivalry. I mean, it's almost ugly between MI5 and MI6. So that plays out. It's a fascinating story if you're into these things. We think we've got problems today. Doesn't even come close to what they were experiencing at that time. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Anybody else? Anybody else have any?
Ray,
Yeah.
Maybe last question. Why did the British not share their ultra information with us?
They didn't trust us. To be frank with you, they didn't trust us. They didn't, when I say us, I'm talking about the American government, the American military establishment as a whole. They frankly didn't trust. We had no system of classifications. The idea of secret and top secret and confidential doesn't really come into the American military way of thinking, and the American intelligence, whatever we want to say, passes for an intelligence community, doesn't really come in until, I'd probably get an argument on this, maybe late 43, 44, and it's under pressure from the British. They say, you have such a terribly haphazard system of your documents, and where our position is, well, everything's classified. Well, no, you've got to have levels of it. So that pressure comes from the British, but essentially, in a nutshell, Hugh, they didn't trust us. And it was only when, I argue, it's only when when Thurston begins to apply pressure to Menzies in November of 19, can you imagine this 28-year-old guy going mano a mano against the head of the British Secret Intelligence Service, saying Hoover's not going to have anything to do with you guys unless you pony up, unless you start becoming. And only then, in December of 1942, do you see the light beginning to go on in Menzies' head. And he begins to share with Donovan. He begins to share with Hoover through Thurston. He begins to share with the military. That's another fascinating story. When William Friedman goes over to London in spring of 1943, and we begin to see just how successful the British have been in breaking the German codes. And that's where you begin to see the agreements that are cast between the American military and the British. That is to say, okay, Great Britain, you're responsible for working on the codes against Germany. We will be responsible for working on the codes against Japan. So it was basically a lack of trust, a lack of confidence. But then as the Americans begin to become the senior partner, that all begins to change. Does that help answer your question? Okay. Anybody else?
One last question.
Well, I simply close by thanking you. It's 1 o'clock in 1 o'clock in the afternoon. You've been a wonderful audience, and thank you for sticking around all this time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer your questions afterwards or at any time in the future. So again, thank you very, very much.